With few exceptions, the online conversation surrounding John Schellenberg's argument from divine hiddenness has been held down by misunderstandings, most of which could be prevented by reading more than a page or two of the source material. Inevitably, these misunderstandings have led to a proliferation of mistaken objections. And so in this video, I want to examine one such objection commonly made by Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy. Now, the goal is to offer clarification and correction. I intend this video not as an attack, but as an invitation to him and to other apologists to take a closer look at the argument from divine hiddenness, even if it is just to more accurately understand what it is that you're criticizing. First, I want to offer a brief primer on the hiddenness argument for those who are less familiar. For those who are quite familiar with the details of the argument, you can skip ahead to the next timestamp. We begin then, as anyone considering the argument philosophically must, from above, by familiarizing ourselves with the concept of love and of what it means to love another person. So what determines the meaning of our concepts? Well, broadly, it's facts about human language, how we use the words that refer to those concepts. The concept of love and the notion of being loving has served to distinguish certain kinds of attitudes, emotions, and behaviors. Some attitudes, emotions, and behaviors count as loving, and others simply don't. And so reflection on the nature of love, specifically as it is directed from one person to another, reveals that while it includes benevolence, where benevolence is construed as a kind of general goodness or giving disposition toward the loved one and what's best for them, that's not the end of the story. Person-directed love is also, and this is a key claim of the hiddenness argument, distinctly oriented toward personal relationship with the loved one. And this is true for at least two reasons. First, because it alone provides the context in which the benevolence just mentioned can be most fully realized, enjoyed, jointly acknowledged, and appreciated. Second, because personal relationships are valuable for their own sake, not merely for instrumental reasons. As Robert Adams recognizes, quote, "It is an abuse of the word love to say that one loves a person if one does not care except instrumentally about one's relation to that object." Schellenberg highlights that love points to a personal relationship, which in this context denotes a conscious and explicit relationship that is meaningful and which allows for things like sharing, teaching, behavior modeling, devotion toward, and forgiveness from another to be exercised and appreciated by the participants. Now, with this in mind, we can see that when one loves another, one may not necessarily seek out relationship with those ones that they love, but one is at the very least minimally open to being in such a personal relationship, open to allowing the other to share in one's life so long as they can accommodate the consequences of that love. And this is highly intuitive. I mean, after all, a concept of love that does not bring with it this kind of bare openness would be a concept of love that is deeply foreign to how that word operates in our language. But we can now apply this simple finding about the nature of love to the notion of a perfectly loving God. If a perfectly loving God exists, God would always love any capable finite creature that there may be. This means that if God exists, God would always be open to personal relationship with such creatures. However, a person's being so open requires that the other party believes that they exist. Only then is their beloved in a position to participate in a relationship with them just by trying. Now, if that's right, then God's being so open just means God ensuring that nothing he does or fails to do ever results in his loved ones failing to believe. Now, is this to be equated with the claim that all capable finite persons would always believe? No. Some individual capable finite persons may for a time and for whatever reason desire not to be in a position to participate in relationship with God, and may then engage in resistant actions or omissions in support of that goal, such that they eventually come to no longer believe that God exists. Now, if Schellenberg's claim is correct, then if a perfectly loving God exists, the only kind of non-belief that could exist is the non-belief that's a result of that resistance. Yet it seems evident that there is plenty of non-belief in the world that is not such a result. And this means that if, as Schellenberg alleges, non-resistant non-believers exist, a perfectly loving God does not exist. So here's a very simplified form of the argument. 1. If a perfectly loving God exists, there are no and have never been any non-resistant non-believers. Premise 2. At least one non-resistant non-believer exists or has existed. Conclusion, therefore no perfectly loving God exists. Now, one thing to notice here is that the second premise of this valid argument is not claiming that all of those who have claimed to be non-resistant non-believers are in fact non-resistant non-believers. It's not even claiming that any particular well-known atheist is a non-resistant non-believer, despite much of the apologetics community being needlessly distracted with that particular question. All it claims is that throughout all of human history, there are or have been at least one non-resistant non-believer. Now, with that necessary background in place, we can then circle back to the main purpose of this video, which is assessing an objection to divine hiddenness made by Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy. Now, that objection is an objection to premise 2, and here's Michael to explain.
Michael, you hinted at this and talked about it a little bit, but I for our listeners, I wanted you to expand on it because I find your thinking here really helpful. Schellenberg's kind of one of his key contentions, if not the key contention, is that there is the existence of these non-resistant non-believers. But if I understand your work correctly, you're quite skeptical of the idea that a non-resistant non-believer actually exists. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I don't see any evidence in psychology that humans are non-resistant non-believers. We as humans tend to defend our beliefs with a fight or flight response. We tend to treat them as if we're being attacked when our own beliefs are attacked. And this is even on very little things. Things like, is Christmas pagan? I've been doing this for years, pointing out Christmas has no pagan origins. And people are shocked when I say that. And they go, no, you're just wrong. You're stupid. And then I give them the evidence and they still believe Christmas is pagan. And most people I have showed that to still believe it is pagan, despite me giving the evidence. And it's especially with people that have made a public proclamation that Christmas is pagan. The moment they have a video or an article or even a Twitter post claiming it's pagan, they defend that until the day they die. Sometimes people who have not made those come around, but other times the other way. We defend our beliefs in ways that are very emotional, very tribal, a very much fight or flight response. And that's just as human nature. We all have rational reasons for our beliefs, but we also have emotional reasons.
Notice that saying,
I don't see any evidence in psychology that humans are non-resistant non-believers,
is very different from saying that what we do know about psychology tells against the existence of non-resistant non-belief. Luckily, in his conversation with Paul Logia on Shannon Q's channel, he helpfully clarifies his view here.
You know, you seem to be psychoanalyzing people and saying there cannot be such a person such that they are really just non-resistant. Is that fair?
I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say there can't be. I would say, given the evidence we see in psychology, it doesn't seem that's likely.
Okay, so the evidence, while not proving the absence of non-resistant non-belief, nevertheless renders non-resistant non-belief unlikely. Now, by the evidence, Jones here is referring to what we know about human psychology. He's arguing that the evidence shows that the tendency to react to perceived threats in ways often referred to as the fight or flight response applies not just to scenarios in which that threat is physical and posing a danger of bodily harm. The tendency is also at work in the face of perceived threats to our own ego, or sense of well-being or self-esteem. A bruise to the ego is a bruise all the same. If somebody confronts us with information that appears to contradict our beliefs, especially those at the very core of our identity, we often feel attacked and begin to aggressively defend those beliefs, or we downplay or avoid that information altogether. So for Jones, these claims, and others like them, show that the second premise is likely false. Of course, the underlying assumption here is that the general psychological tendencies just mentioned are somehow in tension with or incompatible with the notion of non-resistant non-belief featured in Schellenberg's argument. According to Jones, if one is in fight or flight mode, then they are resisting. Now, as I see it, there are at least three major problems with Jones's objection here. The first is that the tendencies that Jones highlights are just that, right? They are tendencies. Even if such cognitive responses were incompatible with non-resistance, this cannot be used to justify a verdict of probably false with respect to the second premise, especially given its modesty. Secondly, even if it were true that all atheists were at all times engaged in confirmation bias to preserve their atheism against belief in God or evidence for belief in God, and even if those responses counted as resistance of the relevant sort, it still wouldn't touch forms of non-belief that result from not even having the concept of a monotheistic God in the first place. However, the third problem with this objection is that it's based on a misunderstanding of the sort of resistance or non-resistance that is relevant to the hiddenness argument. As already noted, Schellenberg defines a non-resistant non-believer as one who, for the time in question, does not believe in God, and that non-belief was not caused by their resistance to God. Notice first how different this is from how Jones defines it.
Schellenberg says are non-resistant non-believers, in that there are non-believers that would believe in God if given enough evidence, but they've not been given enough evidence. Therefore, this should not exist on theism. And that's generally how the argument would go.
Yeah. I'm currently working through the hiddenness argument book, and I think that's an accurate representation.
Now, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure how to interpret the phrase enough evidence in this context. But in any event, Schellenberg's argument just is not in the business of predicting how particular evidence would affect a particular person's beliefs. If instead we want to assess the hiddenness argument on its own merits and assess the veracity of a particular claim of non-resistant non-belief, that assessment should be based on what we can reasonably infer about the actual cause of the non-belief in question, and on whether there is good reason to believe it involved resistance of the relevant sort. But then that brings us to the question of what is the relevant sort of resistance here at play in Schellenberg's argument? Well, for starters, it's not any one of the many non-rational tendencies of human cognition. It's not as though Schellenberg has for the last 30 years been blind to the fact that humans are less than perfectly rational creatures. To see what he actually means with regard to the relevant form of resistance, we need to take a closer look at the argument. Remember how he argues that if a perfectly loving God exists, then God is open to a personal relationship with all capable finite persons, and that such openness requires that such persons be in a position to be able to personally relate to God. However, part of what it means for one to be in a position to personally relate with another means that one believes that the other exists. Right? This is how Schellenberg comes to the view that if a perfectly loving God exists, then God ensures that all capable finite persons are in possession of belief that God exists. That background helps us see why an emphasis on the non-rational tendencies that Jones refers to will not suffice to disqualify a proposed non-resistant non-believer. After all, if something were to disrupt what would otherwise be the doxastic entailments of God's openness, it could not be an act or an omission of perfect love personified. Rather, a finite person's failure to believe, and by extension their failure to be in a position required to relate personally to God, could only ever be the result of that person's own, and here's the key, that person's own self-deceptive resistance. Here's Schellenberg. If we truly start from above, thinking first about love and then about openness, and then about what it would take for God to allow someone not to be in a position to participate in a personal relationship with the divine, we will see that a sort of free resistance sufficient to make it the case that we ourselves have shut the door to any relationship with God that might be on offer would be required. To trade one metaphor for another, if God is open to personal relationship, then the divine light will remain on unless we close our eyes. The self-deceptive resistance required would include a desire component, a desire not to be in a relationship with God, or else to be in a condition incompatible with relationship with God. We might imagine a resistor wanting to do her own thing without considering God's view in the matter, or wanting to do something she regards as in fact contrary to the values cultivated in a relationship with God. But it would also involve actions or omissions, at least mental ones, in support of such a desire. Actions or omissions which have the result that, self-deceived, one no longer believes in the existence of God, although one did to begin with. Here we might imagine careless investigation of one sort or another in relation to the existence of God, or someone deliberately consorting with people who carelessly fail to believe in God and avoiding those who believe, or just over time mentally drifting with her own acquiescence away from any place where she could convincingly be met by evidence of God. Now, if premise 1 of the argument is correct, then if a perfectly loving God exists, then it is only through this sort of intentional, goal-oriented, self-deceptive resistance to God that relevantly capable, finite persons could ever be in a state of non-belief about God. This is in part why Jones's appeals to what we know about cognitive bias in psychology is so wrong-headed. Two of the defining characteristics of the cognitive biases to which he appeals are that they are unconscious and systematic cognitive errors, which is to say that when in play, they could not count as intentional or done with a goal in mind. And for that reason, it's not the case that a person's cognitive bias could be rightly seen as resistance, let alone as the kind of self-deceptive resistance that is of relevance to the hiddenness argument. Here I think it's worth noting that even if we were to grant, contrary to what is in fact the case, that these cognitive biases could count as resistance of the relevant sort, at least in the case of confirmation bias, it would actually push in the exact opposite direction. For in that case, it would be the evidence against theism that would be resisted, because as premise 1 claims, everyone would start off in possession of theistic belief. As a result, it would be the atheistic arguments, or the atheistic evidence, that would be perceived as threatening to one's theistic belief, and therefore most likely to elicit the relevant fight or flight reactions to which Jones appeals. Perhaps, though, Jones is imagining a world much like ours, where finite persons begin with non-belief, which eventually gets updated to belief for those sufficiently sensitive to the evidence, leaving the rest of us with inbuilt biases protective of that initial non-belief. On this interpretation, then, even granting the false claim that cognitive biases count as resistance of the relevant sort, we have to acknowledge the fact that the success of Jones's objection here to the second premise would depend on already having demonstrated the falsity of Schellenberg's first premise. But this move would of course render Jones's objection to the second premise dialectically superfluous at best, and at worst, at least in some dialectical contexts, question-begging. So again, the main problem with Jones's skepticism about non-resistant non-belief is that it's based on this misunderstanding of the sense of resistance at play in Schellenberg's argument, opting instead for a far broader conception of resistance of his own making. All that said, in the spirit of friendly persuasion, I'm now going to turn to what I take to be a very strong case for the existence of non-resistant non-believers, properly understood. That case begins with first acknowledging how the premise is much more antecedently probable relative to its denial. Now, to that point, here is a clip from an earlier video of mine where I elaborate on this particular claim. I want to look at Schellenberg's claim and then compare that claim to the denial of that claim. And so let's look at two mutually exclusive and incompatible hypotheses that are identical in scope and say something about the actual distribution of instances of resistant to non-resistant forms of non-belief. So we could start with hypothesis A, right? So this is Schellenberg's claim, essentially. In all of human history, there was at least one time in a person's life where they, 1, failed to believe that God exists, and 2, it was not the result of their own resistance, right? So again, that's Schellenberg's central claim here. It's essential to his divine hiddenness argument. Now let's look at hypothesis B. In all of human history, there was no time in any person's life where they, 1, failed to believe that God exists, and 2, it was not the result of their own resistance. Now, in our shared background knowledge, we have the fact that throughout all of human history, there are or have been persons who, at some moment in their lives, have failed to believe that God exists. In that last episode, it helped us to see how conceptually broad the tent of non-belief in fact was. Now, interestingly, an instance of non-belief being non-resistant is at least as intrinsically probable as an instance of non-belief being resistant, which is to say that a claim of non-resistance is at least as modest and coherent, and overall at least as simple a claim as one of resistance. But if that's true, then hypothesis A is far more likely antecedently than hypothesis B. Why is that? Well, it's because there are many more ways for hypothesis A to be true than for B to be true. Let's say we infallibly know that in all of human history so far, exactly 1,000 instances of non-belief were resistant. Now, if that were true, then because there have been more than 1,000 instances of non-belief, hypothesis A would be true. Now, what if we knew that there were exactly 1,001 instances of resistant non-belief? well, hypothesis A would still be true. In fact, on all possible combinations, but exactly one, hypothesis A would still be true. Antecedently, then, hypothesis A is much more probable than hypothesis B. But if that's true, then unless there is an overwhelming case to be made for hypothesis B, we should side with hypothesis A. To illustrate this point, suppose we knew that there are 100 marbles in a jar, and we know that each individual marble is either red or blue, and suppose we know that for each individual marble, its being red or its being blue are equally probable. If that's true, then it's obvious that the hypothesis that states that at least one of the marbles is red is going to be more probable than the hypothesis that states that all of the marbles are blue. There's only one possible distribution that allows for that second hypothesis to be correct, whereas there are many more ways that are consistent with the first hypothesis. So what does that mean? It means that before you learn the actual distribution in each case, the form of non-belief or the color of the marble, the structure of the hypothesis under consideration gives reason to think that the first hypothesis of each pair is more likely to be true than the second. Now, this means that unless there is a very powerful case to be made for the categorical denial of non-resistant non-believers, one should accept the premise. Notice, though, that we've yet to dive into any of the evidence here. Fortunately, when we do dive into that evidence, it makes our case for premise 2 even stronger. In his 2007 book, Wisdom to Doubt, A Justification for Religious Skepticism, Schellenberg attends to 4 groups that he sees as the clearest candidates for non-resistant non-believers. The 4 examples he gives are former believers, lifelong seekers, converts to non-theistic religions, and isolated non-theists. Let's examine those 4 categories and why, for Schellenberg, they each represent millions of extremely plausible examples of non-resistant non-belief, and therefore license a confident assent to that second premise. First up are former believers. These are persons who, having been raised in a religious community or household, have dedicated their lives so far to following the God they believe exists, however imperfectly. Consider the inner lives of such people. Some of them have, within that context, come to value and appreciate the challenge and the perceived calling of self-denial, of conforming their will to what they understood God's will to be, and to doing so at great inconvenience and at great sacrifice. Such persons would feel right at home in a world where a loving God exists and enjoy what they perceive as a deep relationship with the Creator of the universe. Moreover, this belief would serve as a kind of cornerstone to their most valued relationships. Their friends, their family, indeed their entire social structure would be unified in part by their love of God. Despite this, in the actual world, some of these persons discover their belief in God fading, and sometimes even completely disappearing. Now, this can happen with the change in perspective commonly associated with significant life events. But what's important to note here is that the loss here it's not willed. It's not an intentional loss. Rather, these moments of loss are experienced as a kind of death and very often require a period of mourning. This can and does often lead to periods of depression. To them, the world has become a darker place. But here's why this category is so suggestive of non-resistant non-belief. If we are to feel rationally entitled to infer a kind of self-deceptive resistance in these people, it will be a resistance to the perceived death of their relationship with God, rather than the other way around. Next, we have lifelong seekers. These are persons who have, for their entire lives, sought out the ultimate with an openness toward whatever form it may take. Their unbelief is the tentative result of a kind of reflective metaphysical groping in the dark. Their hope was that that groping would be temporary, that they've opened their mind with the purpose of closing it on the truth, but they've perpetually failed to find an intellectually satisfying answer. Who can blame them in such a religiously ambiguous world, though? The issue here is that if the truth is God, ultimism personified, we should expect their eager openness to be met with belief in God. For these persons, however, no such belief is acquired. A third category here is converts to non-theistic religions. Such persons are reflective non-believers whose lack of belief in God is the result of them investigating and judging as correct some religious claims that are incompatible with theism. Schellenberg writes, quote, "Such individuals would honestly take themselves to have found a truth that in fact only enmeshed them in a meaning system distortive of what must, if God exists, be the truth. A system according to which, for example, there is no loving personal God. How could a truthful, non-deceptive God countenance such a state of affairs? These persons were sufficiently open and sensitive to the spiritual realm, but happened to land upon the wrong answer. Their non-belief, then, is not the result of resistance to theism, but rather it was a downstream effect of an honest embrace of a contrary view that made the most sense given the evidence available to them at the time. Now, the last alleged type of non-resistant non-belief worth mentioning here is isolated non-theists. Quote, "Consider now the non-resistant non-belief of those who have never been in a position to resist God, because they've never so much as had the idea of an all-knowing and all-powerful spiritual being who is separate from a created universe, but related to it in love squarely before their minds." Schellenberg calls these isolated non-theists as they are epistemically and sometimes geographically isolated from the very concept of God. That there are or have been persons who lacked a concept of full, robust monotheism is not really a serious debate within the sciences. Biologists, anthropologists, and cognitive scientists have brought deep human history into view with some degree of understanding about their beliefs, their values, and their religious practices. For their part, cognitive scientists of religion generally hold to what is referred to as the naturalness of religion thesis. Put simply, humans are naturally predisposed to form and spread beliefs about spiritual agents and religious ideas more broadly. Here's Michael Jones himself quoting from one of the leading figures in this field, Jesse Bering.
Jesse Bering, the former director of the Institute of Cognition and Culture, has published studies on the issue and stated the research shows religion is natural in the sense of being motivated by core, evolved psychological intuitions. It goes on later to say belief is a cognitive default, and that all else being equal, in any given cultural context, religious beliefs are driven into expression by a universal, evolved core set of psychological intuitions present in all normal human brains.
Now, to be clear, by religious ideas, these researchers are not specifically referring to traditional monotheism. Rather, they are referring to an extremely wide variety of ideas, either about or directly relating to supernatural agents or forces. Justin Barrett, a Christian and leading experimental psychologist whose research has been repeatedly cited by Michael Jones, also observes, quote, "Arguably the oldest and most widespread form of God concept is the ancestor spirit or ghost, a type of afterlife belief." Now, if he's right about this, then much more so than traditional monotheism, these limited gods and spirits are a kind of default mode or content of human cognition. For most of all human history, then, the evidence suggests that not only did we not possess belief in a monotheistic God, but a great many of us had lacked even the theological concept to consider. Of course, this is not the end of our best evidence on these matters. Citing the results of recent anthropological work, philosopher Helen de Cruz summarizes, quote, "Monotheism correlates with large group sizes, sedentarism, and literacy, making it unlikely that belief in a personal God arose before the invention of agriculture about 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, a brief time span, given that our species is about 200,000 years old." And so it seems clear that most humans who have ever existed seem to have been spiritually content with much more limited gods. Moreover, even if the concept of monotheism did arise immediately, again contrary to what the evidence suggests, still other evidence strongly suggests that it was very far from ubiquitous. In fact, contemporary scholars generally hold that monotheism was a rather late theological conceptual development even in ancient Israelite religion. Why is this relevant to the hiddenness argument? Well, if these findings hold, then a massive proportion of humans throughout history seem to be great candidates for non-resistant non-believers. This is because their non-belief in traditional monotheism was a result not of resistance, but of the naturalness with which their own cognitive equipment and the cognitive equipment of the human communities to which they belonged acquired and spread beliefs in supernatural agents or concepts other than that of traditional monotheism. For them, it was conceptual or theological ignorance about God that explains their non-belief, not their resistance. So here I've argued that Jones's objection to the hiddenness argument falls short for 3 reasons. First, it treats empirically known tendencies as constants. Second, it focuses on disbelief rather than non-belief more generally. And lastly, it mischaracterizes the relevant notion of resistance at play in the argument. I then argued that the premise toward which his objection was aimed is much more probable than its negation even prior to considering the evidence for and against it. Finally, I turned to a much broader array of evidence to identify large groups of plausibly non-resistant non-believers about which we all have strong interpersonal and scientific testimony with which Jones is already familiar. Now, to be fair to Jones, he has made several objections to the hiddenness argument, and so I do not expect that what I've said here will radically change his mind about the success of the hiddenness argument. Instead, my goal here, again, was simply to offer some modest corrections in hopes that he, with his significant platform, might avoid these mistakes in the future.